Okay, so I think the first major difference that you really want to consider when you look at ASD Essential 8 as a security framework is that it's really not a framework in a comprehensive way, in the way that NIST CSF or ISO 27001 are comprehensive frameworks, in that those two frameworks provide integrations with all of the elements of the organization, including the executive, which is probably the most important component when it comes to implementing and funding and having organizational support for the implementation of a security system. So the ASD Essential 8 is a set of 8 controls. The other frameworks include controls, and there's quite a significant overlap between the controls that are recommended in ISO 27001 and the NIST CSF. Whereas the ASD Essential 8 is just a set of controls that you implement in your organization as recommended by the Australian Signals Directorate. So I think the main thing that people need to understand about the difference between those different frameworks is that ISO 27001 and NIST CSF provide organizations with a way to approach which controls they should implement, whereas the ASD Essential 8 is just a set of 8 controls that the Australian government, specifically the Australian Signals Directorate, believe that all Australian organisations should implement.
So it's like the ASD Essential 8 would be a minimum set of controls if you're going to do anything at all to be, to provide some protection against, threat actors, then implement the ASD Essential 8 controls. If you are looking for a more comprehensive solution, then you would look at the frameworks to complement ASD Essential 8.
Yeah, I'd say I think that the main attraction for the bigger frameworks, especially ISO 27001 for organizations, is going to be that they can use their organization's specific risk scenarios to decide which controls are appropriate for their organization and risk level. And that's different to the ASD Essential 8 because the Essential 8 just sort of says implement these controls. And there's really no good way to decide where the controls should be implemented and what the scope of the controls should be. So we often find when we're consulting to organizations that have or are in the process of implementing the ASD Essential 8, that they're finding it very difficult because the control might not be particularly well adapted for a particular use case. And, that really, if you're just implementing the ASD Essential 8, you're in this situation where there's not much latitude for you to decide which control fits where in your organization. Whereas the NIST CSF and ISO 27001 frameworks are essentially risk-based frameworks, and they allow you to go through the process of uncovering, identifying and quantifying the risks that your organization faces, and then deciding which of those ASD Essential 8 controls you should implement. A good example of that would be application control as a security control. It's an exceptionally difficult control to put in place because it's quite invasive compared to what the user experience is without application control in place. And if you're in a situation where you've got a group of users that are working on something where they don't have access to any particularly sensitive data, and the control is, for a variety of different reasons. There could be a number of different reasons why this is the case, but the control might not be appropriate for those users. And so if you're using a risk-based approach, you can look at that group of users and say, well, they are really not in a situation where, a compromise of their endpoint is going to result in a negative impact for the organization. It might be privately owned devices or something along those lines. And so you can elect not to implement the control if you're using a risk-based approach. If you're just slavishly implementing the control, you find yourself in these situations, and we find this when we talk to customers quite frequently, that they're having to implement the control in circumstances where it doesn't really fit.
I'm going to ask you in a second about the overlap between the controls in ASD Essential 8 with the other two frameworks, but just to circle back for a second on what you've just mentioned about the risk-based approach for NIST Cybersecurity Framework and ISO 27001, that implies that you go through the process of identifying where your risks are and your compliance against the framework, and you track those non-compliances as risks on a risk register, and then you assess the impact and the likelihood of that risk occurring, giving it a score, and then you, being a risk-based framework, you manage your risks down to the point that they become acceptable risks. Is that essentially how?
Yeah. And that's what's important to understand what your organization's risk tolerance is too. If you're operating a lemonade stand, then your risk tolerance is probably quite high. But if you're operating a defense agency, your risk tolerance is going to be very low. So when you're uncovering risks through the operation of your security management system, you're really going to be identifying risks over time and classifying them, and then identifying controls that can be used to reduce those risks. And so that's the selection of controls is a way to reduce the risk, that's been identified through that process. And that's probably something that most organizations that don't have some type of formalized cybersecurity management system of any kind really don't have a grip on, and that is understanding, articulating, and processing their own risks. And so frameworks like the ASD Essential are just there for organizations that really don't have the capability or funding to establish a managed security solution that allows them to identify risks over time. And it just says, okay, let's take these 8 controls and implement them, and that will be the base standard that we will use to ensure that we're at least doing something about security.
Yeah. How do the maturity levels work as far as the ASD Essential 8 goes? You've got 3 maturity levels. What do they typically align with?
It's like so it's an adversary-oriented framework, and really all that means is that you're selecting your maturity level based on the type of adversary that your organization is likely to face. So the maturity levels are really about the adversary more than they are about your organization, but the security controls have to be adapted to the particular adversary level that you're trying to mitigate. So if you're aiming for level 1, you might be an organization that doesn't really process much personally identifiable information. There's not much risk of threat actor activity disrupting your operations because they're so simple, for example, and you really just want to implement the basic level of control. The adversaries at that level are usually quite unskilled. They're not really, they're more kind of select their targets based on opportunity, and they tend to be use well understood tools that the cybersecurity industry has a very good handle on. Level 2 maturity threat actors tend to be a lot more targeted and have a higher level of ability. So this is where kind of ransomware crews and other threat actors that have, or what we would call advanced persistent threat actors begin to operate, and they'll have, repeated sets of procedures that they use, and we'll identify those and mitigate them with a higher level of control. But they are, significantly more capable adversary than you see at level 1. And then at level 3, you're really looking at your nation state level threat actors. So very high level of preparedness, obviously, to mitigate threat actors at that level. So yeah, when you're going through the process of deciding what maturity level you're going to try to aim for as an organization, you're really looking at your own organization and saying, who are my potential adversaries in cyberspace?
So what are we typically seeing for like a school or a local council or a mid-tier organization? What sort of maturity level would they typically be wanting to target? 1, 2, or 3, or somewhere in the middle?
Usually 2, yeah. And I usually say to a lot of these organizations, we're looking at it as level 2.5, because there's a lot of level 3 controls that are easier to implement that you may as well implement if you're going for ASD Essential 8. So a lot of the level 3 controls are about centralized logging and having logging managed and processed by someone who understands the alerts and is able to respond to potential security events and mitigate them in reasonable periods of time after the alert is triggered. So that's really about having a managed security operations center capability or managed detection and response capability. But yeah, level 2.5 is about what I'd recommend most organizations look for. There's some level 3 controls that are very, very difficult to get to. And unless you're as I said, like a defense agency or a state government entity or something along those lines, then you probably don't need to be like aiming for anything above about 2.
Yeah. What about the overlap between the controls, just to circle back on that earlier point?
Yeah.
Is there alignment between the ASD Essential 8 controls and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and ISO 27001, or are they sort of independent?
Yeah, there's almost complete overlap. But the main thing we need to keep in mind is that when you're implementing your controls based on ISO 27001, you don't actually need, like, there's an Annex A control set, which is a list of security controls that you might implement as in response to your risks. And then there's a full description of those controls in an addendum document called ISO 27002. But there's nothing to stop you from selecting your own controls and designing your own controls and documenting how they work as part of your ISO compliance process. So for the most part, though, those controls that are in the ISO 27001 Annex A have complete overlap. I believe every single one of the ASD Essential 8 controls is represented in Annex A. Having said that, there's a lot of other controls that Proaxiom believes are almost as important as the ASD Essential 8, and there's a few notable absences of controls from the ASD Essential 8.
What do you think they are?
Well, in my experience, the biggest one would be network segmentation. So that one's, really, really important, and it's usually the first control that we recommend. So when we consult to customers in an assessment format, and they're not really interested in going directly towards a security compliance framework like NIST CSF or ISO 27001, and they just want to get a lot of bang for their buck in terms of control implementations, we'll make recommendations around the ASD Essential 8. We'll pick an appropriate maturity level and go through those controls. But we also go through a list of controls that are beyond the ASD Essential 8 that actually come from the cyber risk insurance world. And those are really good controls because insurers have arguably nearly as much skin in the game as the customer themselves when it comes to how the disposition of the customer's security is implemented. So one of the first things they ask for is network segmentation and evidence of network segmentation. So this means that you've got a centralized firewall of some kind, and you've got rules that govern how printers and phones and things like that can talk to each other on the network. And that is probably the major control that we see from cyber risk insurers. The other thing is that if you ever see a bulletin in threat intelligence from one of the major threat intelligence research organizations like Cisco Talos or Unit 42 from Palo Alto, they typically have a blanket set of recommendations that they make to mitigate whatever this particular threat is. And it's almost invariable that it will include a recommendation that the network is appropriately segmented. So the other reason why this comes up so often is that when we're talking to customers and we assess their organization, they very often have a very large flat network. And the networks that we see attacked most frequently are the ones that are large and flat and very easy to move around. It makes the job of the adversary so much more difficult if you can't get to some of the vulnerable systems. It's very difficult for you to attack a system if you can't even see it. So I think network segmentation is probably one of the most important controls, and I'm surprised it's not on the ASD Essential 8. I'd have slotted it ahead of some of the other controls if I was devising that framework, I think.